And so you have to spend so much time not thinking about like, oh, this cool weapon I'm designing or this cool quest or this new city. It's like, no, it's like, can we get 7 versions of this tree?
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 410 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast, Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the web programmer.
I'm Sam, but I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is April 7th, 20 Jubilee. Okay.
Took me a while to get it. Sev.
Yeah. Sev. Mm-hmm. You just don't need that extra. You just don't need that extra syllable.
Oh, that's true. I mean, I got it. You could
You
tell
knew
which
exactly
one it is.
what I was.
You could just call it. You just call it Sev. You don't need the N. What do you need the N for?
You don't need it. We can save so much time. This is one of the many innovations that we've been working on here at Butterscotch Shenanigans.
I mean, 7 is the only multi-syllable number, right? Because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Now, get out of there.
Get out of there,
7. Sev.
What's that about?
What's that about? Now, before we go any further, there's going to be cursing on this show. So, just now you know. You already knew that. You definitely already knew that.
Pick it up. It's a vibe. You know what I mean? It just feels like you're on the edge all the time.
I do feel like that's true. There is some sort of a vibe that's like, oh yeah, profanity's coming.
There's a
As
level
soon as you
of
hear
wildness.
voices, you're like, these guys, this is not good. This is something's about to go down.
Curses.
Okay.
They're coming.
Also, we'd like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. If you'd like to support the podcast, go ahead and go over there and
Do that.
Make a little donation.
And if you
Appreciate
wouldn't
it.
like to support the podcast, still go over there and make a donation. And then just
to see how much you hate it.
yeah,
you know?
exactly.
It's good to test yourself.
Wow, I hated that. I'm going to need a bigger sample.
Yeah, we also hate getting donations, but only if they are coming from people who
hate
don't want to
giving
give them to us.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
if you really want to like make us
Yeah, I
feel
really want
bad,
to get under our
skin.
goose.
One goose, couple bucks. Just saying. It's
Yeah.
a good
Pretty
deal.
good deal, really.
All right, gang. Here's the deal. There's a lot of stuff going on in the studio. We're doing crazy stuff in Crashlands 2. We got all kinds of marketing stuff we're working on. Stuff. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Also, a trillion AI things happened this week and last week, and that's always true. So we're just not going to talk about it for a while because
Yeah. Otherwise, it's
all
just be the AI podcast.
yeah. And also, there's like a million YouTube videos every day now about all the AI news. So if you're interested, just go look those up, because it's out there. So instead, we're just going to go right into questions and see if we can blaze through perhaps one, maybe even 2 questions. this episode.
We got a whole episode to do it, so I mean, we could probably get through one.
Ambition is one of our values here at Butterscotch Shenanigans. And that
And
means
speed.
Yeah, that means one question at least.
And also on that note, we are, despite how slowly we answer questions, we're also running out because the way that
We answer them so slowly.
we answer them so slowly, the way the podcast page was set up was to be like, hey, we don't want to, because we answer questions slowly, we don't want to get overwhelmed with the sheer number of questions just ever growing and waiting there, So it has an auto purge functionality that just throws away questions that haven't gotten any votes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But over time, that's basically meant that people kind of ask questions at the rate we answer them because I guess the incentive might be low. And so then we have an ever shrinking collection of questions instead. So please go to podcast.bscotch.net, throw some more questions in the ring. If you've asked a question in the past and it's not there anymore, first, I'm sorry, but then second, please don't ask it again. And my plan is the week that everybody's listening to this podcast to have put out an update to the website that stops
deleting them.
auto-purging
So great.
those questions. So
Yeah, we may still auto prune them after some like extended period of time.
yeah, if there's a lot of questions in there, but we shouldn't be doing that when there's like right now there's like 4 left, I think.
We pruned too hard. We flew too close to the
We've
sun.
pruned too close to the sun. That's also how you make prunes. So
It is. Yep.
just get them close to the sun, baking all that moisture out of there.
Yeah.
And before we get into questions, I need to talk about prunes real quick because I'm so fucking mad about this.
Wait, what are you mad about?
Mad about prunes?
Okay. What's a prune? Tell me.
It's a plum.
Or your plum,
It's a
isn't it?
plum.
It's a shriveled
Right.
up plum.
It's a shriveled up plum why?
It's also a
is
stool
there-
softener.
Yeah. Why is there prune juice? Is that not plum juice?
I don't know. Is it made
depends.
from it when it's a plum? Or is it
It's
made
always
from
a
it
plum.
when it's a prune?
Well, I think when
That
But
would
it
be
can
like
be
it'd be
a
like
plum
calling
and a
wine.
prune.
It would be like calling wine raisin juice. Like it's made of grape juice, right? Like
yeah, but I think it's because you don't take raisins and smash them to make wine. You take grapes and smash them, and there's a taste of it.
Yeah,
Just
do
grape
you-
and raisin, right?
Yeah, where does prune juice come from? Does it come from the process of making prunes?
if a prune is already shriveled up and kind of like dried out, it's not full of juice. The
Yeah,
juice
but
was
maybe-
in the plum.
But maybe
No,
you
these are real
captured it
questions.
while making prunes, So it's like the juice that used to be in the prune, which is what caused it to be a plum. But now it's just
Yeah, I
fucking
guess
prune.
if you called it evaporated plum juice, it's maybe a little less marketable,
Yeah, but the juice had to have come from the plum. That's where the juice was. Now, you take the juice out, you got a prune now. These are the kinds of things.
It does seem like a marketing failure too, right? Because prunes have like a very unappetizing kind of a vibe, right? Compared to a plum, which is like one of the tastiest of
Oh
fruits.
yeah.
And prunes are fine, but mostly like you don't even actually, maybe it's this. Maybe they actually intentionally make those things sound worse because if you eat too much, you just poop everything out of your whole body.
Shit.
That's
And so that way they're like, oh, it's prunes, So like now you have to be in the know to even consider eating it or drinking the prune
They
juice.
should have given it one of those really long drug names instead, like Prunitol or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that way you're like, I'm definitely taking something that's going to wreck my body
Yep.
on the inside.
I like the idea that a company is like, look, we've got all this juice. We're going to sell it. That's a given because money. And when we do that, people will shit so hard their pants fly. Okay.
And then we'll get sued for various shit-related catastrophes.
But
So
it's only
as
a
a-
problem if people didn't know they were going to shit. That's the thing.
Yeah.
It's only a problem.
Well, exactly. So that's why they're saying like, okay, so our goal is to maximize our money and reduce our lawsuits. We're going to sell this pants shitting juice.
Yep.
So we're going to need to just market it in a way that like lets us sell it, but minimizes people's desire for it. You know,
Yeah.
so we can reduce our lawsuits, reduce societal harm from all the shits, and then maximize profit. And that's business. That's how you balance things.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Now I just get that off my chest. Let's go into questions.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, these questions come from podcast.bscotch.net. If you want to get your question on a future episode, go there, ask it, and hopefully we'll stop deleting them. So, highest upvoted question comes from FGKeiji. Kaiji. It's not just like 4 letters. It's like FG and then a name. How do you approach determining the size of each art asset? Especially now that the art is in pixels, was there a target screen resolution or base unit of measurement that helped set the initial foundation?
This is one of those good questions that is very annoying to realize you have to answer when you're making a fucking video game, I will say. Because when you get into making a video game art, you're like, yeah, we make cool monsters, cool creatures, whatever else. You don't say like, but how many pixels do I get to do that? And then how long does it take to figure out how many pixels I need, right? So actually, when we started Crashlands 2, one of the first things we did was basically scale tests, which was to put some rough ideas into a game world, change the camera, change the size of the isometric grid tiles, which did actually shrink quite a bit. All this stuff where it was just like, I don't remember how long it was, like probably 2 weeks of just doing these kind of like rapid scalar changes to see how to get it such that the character was about the size that we wanted. And then that stuff around that character was able to be bigger meaningfully and smaller meaningfully, but still not disappear or take up too much of the screen.
Yeah, because
it's
you
really
want room
annoying.
for variation in scale. But your
Yes.
baseline has to be already like good for people's eyeballs and understanding of silhouettes of things and being able to interpret like animation windups and all that stuff.
Yeah, and there's a final piece to it as well, which is that the size that you represent things on screen is dictated by the mechanics of the game
Yeah.
Yes.
too. So if you think about like, and this works in either like games that have a lot of planning to them or games that have a lot of action. In both cases, zooming out is is better. So if you think about like a Stardew Valley, okay, you're managing your farm, blah, blah, blah. Let's say the character was like 30% bigger. Okay.
Just took
That means
more
that,
of
you
the
know,
screen.
yeah, that means just like everything's 30% bigger because you don't have like a giant character now, like that's the size of a tree. Like you got to scale everything up, which means now you can just see less. You can see less of your farm. You can see less of the town. And it just makes it much harder to make, you know, interesting scenes and
a lot
plan things
less
out, right?
because if you scale that character's height by 30% up, that means you're scaling in both directions the actual window, right? So you're basically zooming in by 30% in both directions, and so you're actually cutting out like an enormous fraction of what used to be.
Yeah, it's an area problem, you know. But then the other thing comes with action. So if you think about a game like Super Meat Boy, which is just your quintessential like fast-paced platformer, I think we measured it out at one point. I think Meat Boy is like 4% of the vertical screen size,
Yeah, it was
or
just
something
50%.
tiny like that. And it's because the character moves so fast, and there's so many other things that are also moving fast that will come and hit you. You need to see them from a long ways off. And so, you know, the first question you need to answer when you're deciding how big anything is how big is the character? Or like how big is the focal point, and what does the player need to be able to see all at one time?
Yes. Yeah. How much do I need to see? And again, like I said, the speed of the game always tells you to zoom out, basically, unless you're trying to, I don't know, do something super claustrophobic or whatever else. So yeah, we started there, and then you get into that 4K question, which is like, okay, so what devices are we targeting? What, you know, aspect ratio is going to be common there? So 1920 by 1080, for example, on, you know, PCs, it's 16 by 9 is the ratio that's used on basically most TVs and monitors and stuff. But in the last couple of years, that has been getting way more wibbly wobbly.
Yeah, that just continues to get less true month by month on every fucking platform.
So now you have to deal with the fact that, like, okay, you want a particular kind of a viewing experience for your game to maximize the impact of the systems and mechanics that you have to get the kind of play you want. But there's an iPad over there that looks like a cookie sheet, and then there's this wraparound insane monitor that someone bought that's 7 times its, you know, height and width, and so you end up.
My wife has one of those ultra wides, and it's just like hilarious looking at it because it just it's like looking through a spaceship window, you know.
Yeah, I mean the worst we've seen.
And it's just so wide.
The worst we've seen, because hers is an ultra wide monitor, which is actually pretty close to the dimensions of like an iPhone. It's like 2.1 by 1.
Yeah.
But there, like, we have had people when we were less well versed and kind of how to handle this kind of like this wild dimension problems. You know, we have had people write us and say like, "Oh, I'm trying to play Crashlands on my 5 by 1 monitor, and it's not working very well." Right? And we're like,
yeah,
what? does anything work well on this monitor?
Yeah,
because also from an interface design perspective, you think about anchor points, right? So like
usually corners of the screen, right? Not usually.
It's the corners of the screen, right? And so you know, you got to think about what happens if the monitor scales so much. And we also think about things like in video games, we use, it doesn't matter if it's 3D, 2D, whatever. We always use lots of tricks to increase performance of the game, where if you can't see something,
it's gone.
Then we do tricks to it to make it less performance like heavy. So in some cases in a game, you'll see like if you enter a building, they'll have like a little curve in the hallway or something like that, so that you actually can't see into the building. And then once you're in the building, you can't see outside. Well, they do that because actually they'll fully despawn all of the game assets in the other space because you can't see them anymore, right?
Yep.
So there's all this like purposeful blocking and stuff. If you have one of these super wide monitors, it's not just that your video card has to work harder to process, you know, all the extra pixels that you have. It's that actually the game, you're now forcing the game to spawn a lot of extra stuff into existence that normally wouldn't have to, because it would be outside of your viewport, right? And so there's all these weird like performance problems that come with these super giant weird monitors. I don't know. I think if you're going beyond like a 2 by 1, you're setting yourself up for a lot of like constant debugging in like every game that you play. Oh yeah, you know.
But yeah, so I think once we get the initial scale of characters and scene established, and again that's based on like systems, mechanics, whatever else. And you could do that by
Speed.
Yeah, speed. You could do that by just look at some reference games that have it do a similar thing or whatever else, and just grab them for that scale difference to start with, and then kind of play with it from there. There's no point in trying to be like, I don't know, taking a blank canvas and going at it because you don't know what you're doing, basically. Given how all these systems tie together. So there's that, and then when it comes to the 4K thing, we decided for Crashlands 2. I think we decided not to care about it, basically, right?
Well, so the way that we handle resolution in 2D games is a little bit different than what you do in a 3D game. So in a 3D game, you've got models, and the models have textures on them. The texture on a model could be any size, really. Like you could have a simple ball 3D model, and then you could have a 4K resolution texture on that ball. Yeah. And if the player's looking at that ball and the player is on like a low res monitor, blah, 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 the texture on the ball is still 4K. It's just
you can't see it.
The monitor just doesn't have enough pixels to render all the detail unless you just like get really close to the ball and keep zooming in on it, right? So it's kind of weird because like in 3D, there can be lots of detail innately in the objects that the monitor just can't render. Mm-hmm. But that's not true in 2D. In 2D, it's just pixel by pixel. So like if Sam makes an art asset, the pixels in the asset, that's all of them. If you zoom in on Sam's drawing of a plant, you're not going to suddenly see way more detail on the leaves, right? Like it's just going to become blurry because we've got to interpolate the pixels. And so we have to first pick that base resolution, which at the moment our default resolution is 1920 by 1080, so it's HD. Mm-hmm. And then we, for larger monitors, we just have to upscale the game. And then when we have different dimensions, so if the monitor's like extra long to the sides, then we just increase the size to the sides, so you can just see more of the world on the side. So we don't stretch it or anything weird like that. And the same thing goes like if you're on a weird like an iPad, we just expand the top and the bottom.
You can just see more.
Yeah. So we establish what we call the safe space, which is just that 1920 by 1080 block in the middle that will always be visible for everybody. And then depending on your shape of your device, you may get a little extra on the sides or the top and the bottom.
And for more extreme cases too, or if you just need more control for some aspect of design, then you just, black bar out. So in Levelhead, we let a camera take control, and it's like one of the things you can do is when you're making levels in Levelhead, right? And as soon as the camera can or we have like a camera detector and that kinds of stuff, right? Related to the player basically hijacking the camera. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that since what you can see depends on your device's shape, right? Yeah. Then it becomes really easy for somebody to try to make something that assumes 1920 by 1080 sort of dimensions, where somebody on a wider device would actually be like off screen or something, right? Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden we can create these scenarios where depending on the player's screen shape, once the camera gets hijacked and just starts, moving on its own or whatever, it can really fuck with the player experience. And so we we identified those points in Levelhead where we actually couldn't let the screen just be kind of an arbitrary aspect ratio. And for those moments, we just force it to be, I assume, 16 by 9, and then just draw black bars to force that to be true.
Because at that point, the camera is a game mechanic, because going off screen kills you. Yep. Right. Once the level designer takes control of the camera and forces the camera to move in certain ways, then it's kind of like those levels in old Mario, right? Where the camera's moving on its own, and if you end up off screen, you're dead, right? Well, like Adam was saying, if one player is on a 5x9 or 5x1 monitor, and then quote going off screen kills you, well, they got so much room, they can never die, right? And so they would be able to make all kinds of cheesy levels that you can only beat on a 5x1 monitor, Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of kind of planning that goes into aspect ratio.
I think the main thing with 4K versus 1K or whatever, right, is actually target device, because it actually is the case that if there are more pixels and someone has more pixels on their screen, as long as you code it up all appropriately, you can actually show more pixels and stuff, right? But if most of your target audience, or it's not even true, it's so what happens in 3D games is they'll just load different textures depending on this scenario, right? So if something is far away, they'll load a low resolution texture on that thing because you wouldn't be able to see the extra pixels, right? Because there aren't enough pixels to show on the screen to show them at that distance or whatever. Yeah. And so that's one of the things that happens a lot in 3D games is basically you have to have multiple textures at different resolutions for different distances, right?
Or even different models. Like in some cases, they'll even do stuff like they'll have like a tiny like 2D image of, say, a tree.
Yeah.
And once the tree gets far enough away, they just get rid of the 3D model entirely, and they just make a little billboarded like picture of a tree back there.
Yeah.
And you don't even notice because, but and that's one of those weird technical things that like you have to do that by hand in 3D games, but not necessarily anymore. Because engines like Unreal Engine now do this kind of stuff out of the box. Like
they just released that update. That's
that's cool. So like you make a 3D model of your tree, and it's like fully detailed and whatever, and then you put like 10,000 of these trees, off in the distance, and you boot up the game, and it somehow is still running at 200 FPS or something. It's like, what's going on? Well, it pre-processed everything, made lower res versions of all that stuff when you uploaded it, and then it will dynamically switch them for you, so you don't have to worry about it.
I have a question.
But the problem is it all has to be in there, right? So if you're trying to ship a game and meet a certain like overall package size, so like if you're targeting mobile or lower end devices or whatever, right? Then you have to decide like, am I going to ship because it still is the case that especially if you're going cross-platform, that most users can't take advantage of 4K, right?
Yes.
But if they have to still load 4K textures on everything, then you're bumping up their memory. Literally, like the memory usage is going up 4x, right? They're like everything is going up 4x in terms of processing, despite the fact that the end result is that you throw almost all that information away, right?
Yeah.
And so that means that you either then say, I don't give a shit if people are wasting their device energy, right, on this task, because either I don't care what happens to low-end devices or
I can't.
Or I can't or whatever, right? Yeah. Or you say, okay, well, let me have multiple textures, just like, so you just have your lower res and your higher res ones, and you just, depending on the device or whatever, right, you just swap in the right one. And that is a strategy that people will take, is they'll start everything at basically like a 4K equivalent kind of resolution, and then scale down based on like the actual size in game or based on like the target device resolution or whatever, and then either settle on one size even though everything starts one way, or end up with lots of alternate textures basically they can swap. But the kind of bang for your buck there is like it's a pretty costly strategy just from like an art asset management perspective, as well as for a final package size, because now you have to pack in all these textures as well, right?
Which is why games are, like 150 gigabytes nowadays or whatever.
Yeah.
Like PC games or console
it's basically it's textures and sounds, right? It's like makes up almost all of that volume.
But it's weird because it's kind of like you would think that, having a game that's now 150 gigabytes is like, isn't that going to be even worse for performance to have a game that has that much stuff? And it's like, no, what the extra stuff is it's just stuff that's hanging out on disk, waiting to be swapped in. It's like a tag team wrestling match, right? It's like, oh shit, the frame rate's tanking. Quick, tag me in. I'm a shitty billboarded version of this tree. I can help with the frame rate. And then they swap that in whenever things go bad, right? So you need a lot of stuff that on swappable things on disk to keep the game running.
Yeah, so it's always a cost benefit thing, right? Which is like, is the value of going 4K so high for your game and your art style, right, that it's worth putting up with all of that stuff?
All the extra pain. Yeah.
So when it comes to bringing 4K to the 2D side, how would that look for us in the case of Crashlands 2?
Yeah,
like, would I just be exporting bigger assets? But then if you're on 1080, you can't.
Well, there's two parts to it. Okay, so let's say just to kind of establish a baseline of what you would do in a 3D game, right? There's kind of like a couple aspects to visual quality. One is how many polygons are in a 3D model, right? And the other is the resolution of the textures that get wrapped around that model, right?
Yeah, and so the polygons have to do with basically how much apparent like shape detail there is, Right.
Yeah. So if something has 10,000 polygons, that sounds like a lot, but actually it's not that much detail. And you'll kind of see like the classic example is like, back in like, the late 90s, video game characters always had like cube hands and
Triangle feet.
triangle feet and stuff like that. Like they just didn't have that many polygons. And so the interesting thing about 3D is you can swap in a new model that has more polygons, or you can swap in a texture for that model that has more pixels. But its relationship to the game world is unchanged. The model's the same size.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's what's confusing me about the 2D case. Because if I double the size of Flux, then she is twice as tall as she was, which means that the camera doesn't work.
Well, because in the end, like things are drawn in 2D the same way they're drawn in 3D, right? Which is basically a triangle identifies some piece of a texture, which is just an image, right? And then basically sends the thing to the graphics card and is like, hey, take this little triangle on this image and then draw it over here on the screen, right? And draw it on the monitor. And so basically when you tell the graphics card, like, here, grab this like, let's just 100 pixel by 100 pixel triangle, right? If you say, go grab this 100 pixel by 100 pixel triangle out of the texture image, but then draw it onto the screen at this 200 by 200 triangle, right? Then it'll basically interpolate the stuff in between, right? Like
So do you do it, but you do it the other way then?
Yeah, so you basically do it the other way around if you're doing like, if you've got 4K textures and you want to draw them.
You draw at 50%.
Yeah, it's in the same way, like you can like, because you can just like, we already do, right? When we make our assets and then we give them a random scale of like, oh, let's let it scale down to 80% or whatever.
My
right?
question there though is that like when we do that for assets, then there's a point at which the asset becomes less sharp.
Well, because the question is what's happening
scale
for
down.
pixels that don't
Yes.
exist, either in the image or on the monitor, right? So if you've got a 4K image and you're sort of like zooming in on it, right? Then you're basically, you have to, every time you're not at the full scale of the image, you have to invent pixels that aren't there, right? Because you can't show all the pixels because there's too many, right? So you have to like compress that into a fake image that represents that by, in effect, blurring it, right? Because you're sampling that original image to create a new one that has fewer pixels. It's a downscaling, right? Similar when you upscale. If you've got too small of an image, now you need to fill more pixels. Then it's like, okay, it's literally you just make a new image now, right? So if you think of it like if you're revealing a 4K image, then what you're actually doing is you're creating, like if you imagine zooming on it slowly, you're creating successive new images that are basically invented by trying to interpolate what would be there if the image was actually that small, right?
So, but wouldn't it just be blurry?
And it's not blurry exactly because like these algorithms are really good for like guessing. And also if the thing is relatively small, then that means you can't see as many details anyway, right? So you don't really notice as much that the details are worse. But it is the case though that because the difference between like the actual graphic, like on a pixel to pixel exact relationship. So if you have exactly the pixels from the texture on the pixels on the screen, that's always when it's going to look the sharpest and the best, right? But
1-to-1.
1-to-1. But as soon as you have to start inventing data by either drawing pixels that aren't there or throwing pixels away, right? Then you're basically, it can't look as sharp. But just how not sharp it looks depends on the algorithm that's doing that work and the relative difference in that scale.
Got it. So we decided then to go with the 1920 by 1080 because we're like, we know this will look as we intend it to look for most people. And as an important art consideration, as an artist, you can spend a lot of time on details that people cannot see. I used to work with vector. I've talked about this before because you could just zoom in, you can keep on zooming in vector. And the reality is that, again, when it gets exported from your vector program into a PNG, it's actually undergoing this process Adam's talking about, which is there's a lossiness happening where it's converting, the points where there's a black line between 17 different pixels as it sort of moves because it's not drawn in pixel space. How do you interpret that as you export the thing? So you actually always end up with blurry chunks.
Yeah, and this is where the whole anti-aliasing and like these like concepts that you see and like how many subsamples to take. Well, that's basically all those are basically about how good of a job do we do? How much computational energy do we throw at trying to get really good sort of interpolations / interpretations, right? Of like going away from the one-to-one scale. But there's actually a piece of this that's people don't think about as much, which is there's a reason why you could actually scale stuff like up and down pretty aggressively, and it doesn't seem less sharp. And that's because unless you're doing a pixel perfect game, which you don't see in 3D, but you often see in like 2D pixel style games, where things also move on a pixel by pixel basis. So like a character is in one position with all of its pixels and it moves to like another adjacent set of pixels or whatever, right? Then you're always already having to interpolate between pixels, because now you can imagine like the image that you're trying to draw is offset on the monitor by like a half pixel.
Yes. Which we've had to deal with that with the camera before.
Yeah, because now you can't draw that either, because that means that the pixels that are being drawn are the ones that are halfway in between the pixels that actually exist, right? So that to actually accomplish that, you have to go through that same process of aliasing. And so like in our games, the vast majority of the time, any given image is between pixels. It's in some sub-pixel coordinate, right? And it's also being scaled usually by some like 10% or whatever up or down, right? And so we're already occupying that space all the time, basically, and almost never have like a perfect pixel to pixel lineup. And so if we were to, for example, have everything start at 4K and then just draw it downscaled by half, right, on monitors that basically like draw things at 10 or 1K, right, then it would basically look the same as it does right now, right? But if we were then to draw everything bigger, as in like tell everything actually to draw it at a 1-to-1 scale on people who have large enough monitors that we can support it, then all of a sudden, like all those pixels that were being thrown away, which are still usually being sub-pixel sampled because they're not actually directly 1-to-1, right? But there's still a lot more pixels there, so the detail is going to look better.
Yeah, this also kind of changes depending on device and like something that you can try if you've got crash lands on PC and on something like an Android device or an iPhone. If you zoom in a bunch, so like you can change the field of view in crash lands. So if you change the field of view to the smallest field of view and then run it on your desktop PC, you'll notice that like flux in the center of the screen is kind of blurry.
Yep.
But if you do that on a phone, flux is actually quite sharp because the way the rendering pipeline works on desktop versus on a phone is just different. And the fact that like the phones have a higher pixel density and all this other stuff going on, and like we actually do have flux in Crashlands. Flux is actually output at double scale, and then we scaled flux down by half. And on a phone, those extra pixels actually do come through.
Yeah, presumably because they're on a phone, there are just more pixels there actually, right? But it's kind of strange because like even if I do it on my 4K monitor on my desktop, flux would still be blurry. And it's that for whatever reason, because of the operating system and game maker and whatever, it's that like if I say this game is what was Crashlands originally? It was like 960 by 540. It's 540p. Right? So it's like,
we're old.
So like if I say, all right, my viewport is 960 by 540, then on a desktop machine, those are the pixels that I have in my viewport. But on mobile, it actually does still give me all the pixels that the display has, and GameMaker just kind of like
interpolates,
stretches things to make them big enough to fill the space. So it's all very, there's like different platforms, different aspect ratios, different, like all these different things.
Yeah. It's one of the things that you learn very quickly with cross-platform development. This is also true for web dev, where there's so many differences between devices that if you're designing with a 1-to-1 plan where you're like, this is exactly how many pixels wide this thing is, this is exactly what it's supposed to look like this is exactly the color profile, like all these kinds of things, right? You will inevitably be extremely bummed out when you flip it up on some other device you haven't looked at yet, and you're like, the fuck is it's like it's like for web dev, it used to be the case that that's what people tried to do, right? And like the earlier days before smartphones and stuff, and then as smartphones became really dominant and screen sizes kind of started to get all over the place, and they're vertical most of the time and tiny, right, and all this stuff. Then people had to really change approaches to just it's more of like it's almost like a spitballing kind of a process, right? Where you're like this is where roughly it's supposed to be, and you kind of create a range of like desired outcomes, and you try to make things fit within that range. But otherwise you're not too picky about it. Because there's even stuff like the latest, like literally like within months ago, changes to like the web with CSS is new color types, like new ways to specify color that actually give you access to colors that cannot be defined in RGB space. That historically, like the reason that we were trapped there was because our monitors could only render those colors, right? But there are now monitors out there that actually can display colors that are not in the normal RGB space, right? That have not been available on monitors before, basically. Like increasing the possible color space, right? And so now you can use these new color models like in CSS or whatever, right? But if you do that, then you open it up on a monitor that supports it and the one that doesn't, right? The one that doesn't literally can't draw that color, right? It's just physically impossible. And so what it has to do is try to like find a different color, right? That like is the same, right? But what does that mean in color space? Because if you do any color like deep dives at all you'll find is
it's horrific.
Oh, it is a fucking hot mess, right? It's a wild world.
If you ever want to get something printed that you make digitally.
Printing is a good example. It's the same problem, right?
Pants. Yeah, it's the same problem. Your printers can only print at certain color spaces. And so you might have a really cool design you made that the colors you chose for it just literally aren't available. You cannot use those colors. And so you have to pick some proxies, but then your values are all messed up. So the whole thing just looks dumb and soupy, at the end of the day, because it doesn't work correctly. Oh man. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And you can even see this on your own monitor, just switching between like different, because you can change your saturation and like no two people are experiencing the same thing, even just at the color level, right?
Welcome to hell.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're just designing for you just need a lot of wiggle room. You're aiming for a design that whether it's like color or resolutions or whatever, that like kind of, it's like a bell curve, right? Mm-hmm. That handles like the 90% of the most common cases in the middle quite well. Then there's like fringe cases that it can accommodate that maybe aren't perfect, but like good enough. And then there'll be cases on the very extremes where you're like, fuck that. We're not even going to do it.
Yeah. And the trick to all this stuff is trying to figure out like, okay, what do I, given all the constraints you're designing against, so like what your target audience is and all that kind of stuff, is just how do you design with this like flexibility first, so that while any one outcome may not be like the ideal one that you envision, that they're all fine, right? So even like Seth mentioned earlier, like if you have to deal with wide ass screens and you're used to pinning things to corners for like HUD stuff, right? If you instead pin them relative to the center, so that now like they start positioning themselves relative to the center of the screen, then all of a sudden you're like, okay, cool, I don't have to worry about.
There will always be a center.
There's always a center, right? Always. And so now you don't have to worry about if things are flying off to the edges of the screen, right?
Yeah. Or what you do is you kind of establish fake corners where you say like, okay, I'm not gonna actually pin them to the corners of the screen. I'm gonna make like a fake box.
Yeah, you make a 16:9 fake box, right?
Yeah, maybe like that box is normally the size of the screen, but once the screen starts getting too wide, that box will stop getting wider, right? And that's the box that we actually pin the UI stuff to, right? So there's all these, and this is kind of it shouldn't have been much of a revelation, but in retrospect, it kind of was. Where like when I got into making games, it was like game jams, small games, blah blah blah, and also it was at a time where like iPhones were all 16:9. Mm-hmm. All smartphones were 16:9. Desktop was all 16:9 with the occasional 4:3 like old ass monitor, right? And over time, as we started actually like making commercial games that we wanted to sell, and like if you go to the Google Play console and you can see like, okay, here's the 43,000 different Android devices with all their different specs, right? And you start to realize,
and that's only barely exaggeration, because like the last time I checked, it was 16,000 or something.
Yeah, it's so many, and they phase a lot out over time too, right? And so it's kind of like you kind of don't realize at the beginning just how much of your work isn't in like designing the game, like the game mechanics and stuff. It's compromising the design of the game against all of these other like wildly unpredictable platform requirements and specs, and even simple stuff like you would think that you should be able to read controller inputs with your game, right? Mm-hmm. Except not every controller sends the same inputs.
There is no industry standard for controllers. There are some standards, but even though there are some, like most rando controller companies just do their own thing anyway.
Yeah, and what makes Steam so good is that it is like you can actually use like a PlayStation controller with games on Steam, because Steam actually has an intermediate layer that they have set up to handle all these different controllers and convert them into a universal input. And so there's just all these layers of whether it's like localization, aspect ratios, controllers, interface design, blah, 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 resolution of like how big are the artist sets. There's just like a million technical problems that you have to reconcile. And if you don't, then if you don't worry about any of those things, then most of your players will have a bad experience because at least one of those problems will hit the average person, right? And so you have to spend so much time not thinking about like, oh, this cool weapon I'm designing or this cool quest or this new city. It's like, no, it's like, can we get 7 versions of this tree so that the game can run better, you know?
Yeah. And which is all to say, like, that's a lot of why we design around like mid-tier kinds of devices typically, right? And so we design towards like high-end mobile and then like mid-low-tier desktop as much as we can, because that's the space where we can where within those constraints, we're comfortable with the kinds of stuff that we can and do make, and why like we don't go into 4K, because even though it'd be really cool on a 4K monitor or even on a 2.5 or 3K or whatever monitor, it could in theory like make things look really nice. But it might not even, like, we have to learn a whole bunch of technical stuff to actually make that be true, right? And then now all of a sudden, if we want that to work on lower end devices or on mobile or on Switch or something, right? Then we are gonna need to we're gonna need new textures anyway, right?
We gotta do a lot more work.
Yeah. And so we try to find that sweet spot of it's gonna be a great experience for everybody, right? And where we try to this is also why we use this cartoony style, right? Because the cartoony style survives like downscaling and upscaling like really well, and other styles don't necessarily.
Yeah, people are mad about it because it's not realistic, right? It's not like what this person now just looks like a really weird billboard.
Oh, I mean, this has been something that I've always admired about Blizzard's approach to making World of Warcraft, because it came out in 2004. And it did not have cutting edge graphics in 2004 at that time, right? Like it looked pretty mediocre, honestly.
I mean, I assume
in terms of
it looks good today, right? But it still doesn't have cutting edge graphics.
Yeah, right? And it never will, because that's by design. They've purposely stylized the art for this reason, right? So it's not photorealistic, right? It's kind of a bit cartoony, and kind of hyper exaggerated. Like it's kind of famous for like characters that have insanely huge shoulder pads, right? And it's like it's because, especially back in the day when your typical monitor was like 1024 by 768 was like the resolution back then. And you're playing this game where you're going to see lots of characters on your screen and you're zoomed out in a third person view and your own character's kind of small. Then having like 1 or 2 big distinguishing features like a helm and big shoulder pads, right? Yep. Or a weapon that's like twice the size of your character made it so that you could actually visually read stuff, right? And that style has persisted through almost 20 years now, and they've upgraded stuff, and they've been sort of like over the years slowly making the character models have more polygons and upgrading the environments and all that. But that kind of approach does stand the test of time, because if you want a counterexample of this, go watch Tron Legacy. Okay. Tron Legacy does a CGI Jeff Bridges that does not hold up. It's and it looked kind of whack at the time, but now that visual effects technology has just continually made it easier to make things more photorealistic, right? Then if you're aiming for that realism, then you are just fully constrained by the technology at the time, and you can only make it look so good, right? But if you pick a style and go with that, and it already looks good, then it'll always.
Yeah, well, because you can you can put up Crashlands on your 4K monitor, like right now, like OG Crashlands, right? And like, you can tell it's got low texture density, right? But at the same time, you probably don't give a shit. It's a rare person who gives a shit because the thing is stylized in such a way that it
Why
feels.
would you give a shit?
Right. Yeah. It feels actually like it makes more sense actually that it's like pixely, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's a lot of things you can do to mitigate some of the technical issues that you're going to come across as you're working on like art and all of that stuff. Going for that hyper realism, I think, does kind of put you into a box, right? Where like if you got hyper realistic trees, then that means like as a player gets close to them, they need to have a lot of detail, which also means as you get far away, the detail needs to go away. Otherwise, the computer catches on fire. So lots of stuff to consider. Yep. And I think that's probably all the time we have, honestly.
Is it just one?
One question. I mean, we could take a crack at a second one if you guys think you want to. If we can do it quick.
Is it a quick one? I don't know. So I don't know what the question is.
There's no such.
That's fair.
Here's the thing. It's not the question that's the problem.
Am I the drama? Next time.
Yeah,
next time.
Yeah.
All right, and also we'll open up the we'll make the pruning on the site less aggressive.
Yeah.
So
go put some questions in there.
Yeah.
Plop them in.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. So we'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DeCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the archives. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Bye.